Okay, that is what you can have, that they come in, that they say cheese, of course, I wanna kiss the bottle, of course, that is what you can have, of course, no one can against me, I'm still drunk, that is what you can have, say cheese, of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, of course, that is what you can have, that everyone wants some milk, of course, everyone wants some alcohol, of course, that is what you can have, that everyone is calling at me, that is what you can have, and they want my alcohol bottle, that is what you can have, but okay, they wanna steal it from me, of course, but they have an ugly swan there in the throne, of course, what can I do against that? Just nothing, of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, that they have an ugly swan in the throne, they want to bring me in and steal my bottle, of course, what can I do against that? Just nothing, just keep here, that is what you can have, of course, and she loves me, of course, that is what you can have, when we cash we see, of course, I think I win, of course, but okay, when we cash we see, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, that I have the money, of course, that is what you can have, that they drive my Harley, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, and see if you can beat that, of course, that is what you can have, and I have here some gypsy money, of course, that is what you can have, but okay, see if you can beat that, of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, of course, that is what you can have, of course. Of course, motherfucker, I'm gonna kiss the bottle, of course, that is what you can have, that you want to bring an ugly swan to the throne, okay, then do that, of course, what can you do against that? Just nothing, of course, but if you come with the swans, I tell you have my car license, of course, no one can against me, that is what you can have, that I have my car license, if you come with some ugly swans in the throne, I have my car license and no one can against me, that is what you can have, that you cannot beat me, that is what you can have, that I have my car license and that no one can against me, that I'm gonna drive, of course, that is what you can say, that no one can against me, so don't cross a Black Panther, of course, that is what you can have, that you have to have the capital letters and let them, of course, Mike is shooting, but the devil, the Kaisarian, so don't neglect and things like those, they have my license, of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so come on, of course, that is what you can have, and then tie me to the hospital, of course, in fact, my ass tied to the hospital, of course, don't do that, of course, I'm with my Ice Age, of course, no one can against me, that I'm gonna kiss, of course, that is what you can have, don't fuck my ass tied in the hospital, of course, motherfucker, that is what you can have, that I'm in my Ice Age.
Eureka Beats.
Of course, motherfuckers, just chill, that is what you can have, just chill, world is yours, you have to find the capital letters and let them, so just chill, that is what you can have, that no one can against us, of course, that is what you can say, that you have to find the capital letters and let them, so just chill and don't care about nothing, of course, that is what you can have, and if you're in the throne, just find the capital letters and let them, of course, you're gonna be screaming and forcing if you love it, of course, so find the capital letters and let them, of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so what are you gonna say, of course, motherfucker, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, of course, there is steak for dinner, of course, there is some tongue and vinegar in the car slice and some tongue with vinegar, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, that there is steak for dinner, of course, you wanna operate my girl, of course, then just operate her, of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, of course, that is what you can have, that you wanna make us fun from her, but you have to find the capital letters and let them and the car license and the micros, of course, and let them, of course. Of course, motherfuckers, I just wanted to be in the spring with my girl, of course, and you keep her away from me, of course. I was in the spring with my girlfriend, and you keep her and gave her a throne bill, of course. Then what can I do against that? Just nothing. I have an ugly swan in the throat. Of course, then just go. Of course, motherfuckers, I have an ugly swan in the throat. Of course, what can I do against that? Just nothing. Of course, just tell you that I have my car license. Of course, that don't fuck my ass in the hospital, in the ice age, of course, and things like those, and that the world is yours and that you have to check that there's what you can have, that the weather is frozen, of course, that there's what you can have, that world is yours, and you have to chill, of course, that there's what you can have, that world is yours, and you have to find the capital letters and let them suggest chill and then put your kid in this frozen weather. Of course, motherfucker, world is yours and you have to find the capital letters and let them suggest chill and don't care about nothing. Of course, that there's what you can have, that the weather is frozen. Of course, that I'm smoking some hash with my woo. Of course, motherfuckers, that there's what you can have, that no one can against me, so come on. Of course, that there's what you can have. Of course, motherfuckers, just chill, world is yours, just chill and don't care about nothing. That is what you can have, that no one can against me, so come on. Of course, that is what you can have, that they wanna steal my body. Of course, everyone is calling at me, I have to hold alcohol. Of course, that is what you can have. You can see on stage that my grandfather was the fox, of course, and they shoot him with a gun, of course. What can I do against that? Just nothing. Another one has to be alcohol from me with an obvious one in the throat. But okay, I already told you I have my cards license. Don't fuck my ass in the hospital. There is age, of course, and things like that. Of course, on that too, because world is yours, of course, that I'm gonna kiss the battle, of course, wanna operate maker. You wanna make her a bitch, operate this bitch, okay, just do that, what can you do against that, just nothing, of course, that is what you can have, that you have this one done. Just go, of course, you have to find the capital letters and let them appear in the throne, of course, and nothing else, of course, motherfuckers, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, of course, that there is steak for dinner, some time and vinegar, of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so come on, of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, that I have my car license, of course, and don't fuck my ass in the hospital and chill because world is yours, of course, motherfucker, and I give a damn about your ugly swan in the throne, of course, they are gonna prefer us. Eureka Beats. Of course, everyone is calling on me. I have the alcohol bottle, of course, that is what you can have. That everyone is calling at me. That is what you can have. That I have the alcohol bottle. That is what you can have, of course. That is what you can see. That my grandfather was a boxer in the red and he was the boss, and then they shot him with a chew gun, of course. And the king want to steal my bottle, of course, the king wants to steal my alcohol, of course, with his ugly little swan, of course, but okay, what can you do against that, that they are gonna prefer us, of course, I mean, my heart will beat that if you can, of course, and I'm with my gypsy money, the Harley, of course, my gypsy money, and the bill on the throne, of course, see if you can beat that, because I think you can beat that also not, Of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, that I have my tips to money in the throne. Of course, they wanna make your bitch from the court and give her a will, give me at least one, of course, but okay, your at least one is not gonna win. Of course, you have an at least one in the throne. Of course, I'm with John there. Of course, that is what you can have, that you cannot beat me, that I'm in my heart. That is what you can have, that no one can
Eureka Beats.
steal my body, just stole the body from my grandfather when he was the first in the radio with the chicken. Now you wanna steal the body from me, but I think you can. But that's what you can have, that directly so it's not gonna win, and that they are gonna prefer me. Revolutionary money, of course, my democratic revolutionary money, they are gonna prefer that, they can show you that, of course, that's what you can have, so go on, of course, what are you gonna say, you cannot steal the ballot from me, of course, that is what you can have, no one can against me, but they have to alcohol, fuck, and no one can against me, but they are all calling at me, and they are gonna keep calling at me. Of course, that is what you can have, to turn a Caesarian, so don't neglect. I'm gonna drink the whole wine, of course, with my Antichrist. I'm gonna smoke some browns and drink the whole wine from the Caesarian, but you don't have to neglect. Of course, you wanna export wine, of course, I'm gonna drink the whole wine, motherfuckers. That is what you can have, that no one can against me, so come on, of course, you cannot take the ballot from me. That is what you can have, that I have everything and no one can against me, so come on, of course, there is one with the state for them, so go on.